Greetings, fellow political philosophers. This is number 2 of this series of videos summarizing arguments from my book, Against the State, An Introduction to Anarchist Political Theory. Arguments against the main arguments for the legitimacy of state power. And the first one was on social contract theory. Now, you may remember that Hobbes describes the state of nature, that is, people living without a government, as a terrible situation, because everyone is subject to predation. There's no authority to restrain people from pillaging, raping, killing, and so everyone is vulnerable all the time. So that's why, for Hobbes, they come together and they form a contract and they establish a state. Now, David Hume, in his classic essay of the original contract, asks, well, why should we rest the state, the legitimacy of the state, on the obligation to keep promises? That's what underpins the contract. That's why we should obey the state after we make the contract, because we promised to. Why should we rest it on that when there is no such promise, and when the obligation to obey promises itself is only justified on utilitarian grounds? That is, the effects of a breakdown of the institution of promising would be disastrous. Utilitarianism is the view that any act, institution, policy is to be evaluated by its effects, and usually specifically on its effects on people's happiness. So if among the options a given action or policy or institution has the best effects on the happiness of those whose happiness is affected, it's right, and it's the morally legitimate item. Okay, so if Hobbes is right that life is disastrous without a political state, that's plenty, according to Hume, to justify the political state. You don't need this fiction of a promise, which isn't doing any work ultimately anyway. Okay, so that's the argument. Now, let me just say this, that the utilitarian effects of the state have not been overall obviously positive. One way to see this is that the wars and genocides of the last couple of hundred years are virtually all the work of political states. So the Holocaust, Stalin's forced collectivization of agriculture, the Cultural Revolution of Mao, the killing fields of the Khmer Rouge, even Rwanda. These are all acts of the state, and furthermore, they're acts, I submit, that could only have been performed by a state power. That is, to form up your whole society into a mass killing machine, you need forced taxation, you need patriotism, you need control of the media of communications, you need a scientific infrastructure to develop your machinery of death, and so on. Millions upon millions of people have sacrificed their lives to state power. And the same is true really of the wars of the last couple hundred years, as I say, and the amazing technologies of death, which may actually end up completely annihilating the human species or the planet. It's hard to imagine any other kind of human group coming up with atomic weaponry, for instance, and using it. Again, you need taxation, you need a patriotic scientific infrastructure, and so on. So I'm just saying that the utilitarian effects of the state, just eyeballing them, haven't been that wonderful. In fact, no force has probably been more destructive to human happiness than the state in some sense. On the other hand, for utilitarians, the states that do turn into killing machines are not legitimate states. That is, they have bad effects on people's happiness. So they're not morally justified. So if you have a nice mellow Switzerland or whatever, right on. But Nazi Germany obviously cannot be justified on utilitarian grounds. So that's good. On the other hand, let me say this. If the state does consist of a group of people with a monopoly on force, it is an always full reservoir of utilitarian disaster. It's always possible that a state like that will mutate into a killing machine, will mobilize for war, let's say, or for genocide. And if it does, there is absolutely nothing you can do about it because it possesses overwhelming, annihilating physical force. All right? So, in my opinion, even a state that has had no negative, or has had few negative utilitarian effects, is always just about to mutate into a utilitarian disaster. That is, and I think that actually in the long run, because there doesn't seem to be any realistic way out of the state, the utilitarian prospects of the human species are extremely poor. That is, we have groups of people with the technology and the resources to annihilate big sections of our species and our planet. That's what the state is. And since that's what the state is, and since people have a tendency to use those resources once they're in place, we're fucked on utilitarian grounds. But certainly I want to say, eyeballing the last couple hundred years, a utilitarian justification of the state is absurd. Later, with more.